according to no one. It was therefore acceptable for the British to declare the country for their king and deny the land rights of Indigenous Australians for the following 200 years. Some of these observations and assumptions included that the Indigenous population was so small they could not possibly lay claim to the land, that they were savages who were not technologically advanced, that they were primitive hunter-gatherers who did not cultivate the land, that they were not warlike or capable of fighting back against colonial forces. They were lazy, dirty and lacking intelligence. They did not build houses or wear clothes. They were idle, wretched and miserable, and often likened to animals. Although not all early colonisers believed these dehumanising and racist assertions, the general belief was that Indigenous Australians were the lowest form of humanity, and this rationalised the acts of dispossession, violence and exploitation that were to come. Bundjalung word, meaning pack of lies. Firstly, pre-contact population numbers were more like 1.5 million and growing, and is now what we know to be the oldest continuing culture in the world. As you can see from this language map, Indigenous people lived right across Australia, and hundreds of different languages and dialects were spoken. This is far from the notion of terra nullius. Most Europeans fail to understand that the relationship to the land and connection to country is fundamental to Indigenous persons' identity. They did not see that, contrary to being lazy, unintelligent, nomadic and without spirituality, they had developed complex laws, strong sense of kinship with family and the environment, and they used sophisticated knowledge of science, navigation, tools and art, which have been passed on orally for tens of thousands of years. They had learnt to live sustainably on the land without overhunting or trying to grow plants out of season. Impacts of terra nullius. Invasion resulted in frontier wars and massacres, leading to the deaths of 20,000 Indigenous people and 3,000 Europeans. Colonists tried to stop Indigenous people speaking their own languages, which has resulted in the loss of hundreds of languages since first contact. Because of terra nullius, no treaty has ever been signed with the Indigenous people, which demonstrates an ongoing denial of pre-contact occupation and land rights. Intergenerational trauma has been caused by separating people from their culture, country and families, and the experiencing racial discrimination has been shown to lead to an increase in self-destructive behaviours. The initial sense of cultural superiority and the racist stereotypes that Europeans felt has not faded with time, as Indigenous people continue to experience discrimination through media and society. Indigenous people are 14 times more likely to be arrested than non-Indigenous people. They're more likely to die in custody. They're less likely to finish school. They earn less and experience double the victimisation rates than compared to their fellow Australians. Adam Goodes is shown here confronting a teenage girl for calling him an ape during a football match in 2018. So why should teachers have an understanding of the meaning and consequences of terra nullius? Up until the 1970s, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island culture and history was largely ignored in schools, and teachers themselves, until very recently, have been denied appropriate exposure to Indigenous perspectives in their training. This is what Rose 2012 calls the silent apartheid, where Indigenous perspectives have been ignored or falsehoods and stereotypes have been taught to children, thus continuing the cycle of racism and ignorance. We cannot continue to deny pre-contact Indigenous history as though it is not part of our own, nor can we continue to separate European and Indigenous history as though we live parallel to each other rather than having shared experiences. Even if the past is painful to discuss and admit to, how can we expect to move forward and make changes if we do not acknowledge what has led to this point? Teaching Indigenous perspectives in schools is critical for meeting the goals of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Policy and the National Professional Standards for Teaching, as it is viewed as crucial in making inroads within the reconciliation process. If teachers do not understand terra nullius, we risk teaching incorrect content. Imagine being an Indigenous student, being told how Captain Cook discovered Australia. It would be false, offensive, and cause confusion. So how does having knowledge about terra nullius contribute to deeper understandings about teaching and learning with Indigenous cultures? We need to learn to stand on the shore rather than the ship. We must try to engage in experiences which allow us to step into someone else's position so that we can counteract the misconceptions about first contact. By acknowledging past wrongdoings, racist views and generalisations stemming from terra nullius, we can re-educate Australians and teach them not to ignore differences, but to be able to respond appropriately to them. We need to incorporate Aboriginal knowledge, culture and history across all learning areas in a holistic approach, which can benefit both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students by creating a better understanding and demonstrating that this culture is valued and important in our society. A week on Mabo Day or National Reconciliation Week by having students do dot paintings or having local community members teaching dance or painting children's faces. What does this teach students and the community about contemporary life? These types of sporadic events and activities provide, as Dermot Sparks 2011 says, opportunities for children to visit Indigenous culture, but then return to the dominant culture once the event is over. This only allows them to experience it on a surface level and therefore not gain any real understanding of the meaning or significance behind it. This tourist curriculum tends to emphasise the exotic differences between the two cultures and does not give students opportunities to learn about everyday contemporary culture. Often these events perpetrate Indigenous stereotypes and imply that Aboriginal culture is homogenous. For example, dot paintings are often shown as the only form of Indigenous art. However, there are many different types which vary across Australia and range from ancient to contemporary, including weaving, sculpting, bark paintings, watercolours, cave paintings and rock art. Or here we have something called a ghost net, which is highlighting the problem of plastic in our oceans. It is important that children are exposed to both contemporary and traditional forms of Indigenous culture, as their frame of reference can often be locked in the time of terra nullius. Indigenous culture is continuing and has adapted and grown. For example, hip-hop music has become a modern form of storytelling for some young Indigenous people, which continues the tradition of passing on knowledge orally, but in a way that young people can relate to. It is also important not just to limit children's exposure to Indigenous culture through art and music. Although important in Indigenous culture, not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are artistic. Their culture is as multifaceted and varied as non-Indigenous cultures. These types of stereotypes may also alienate Indigenous students if they do not identify with that aspect of their culture. How can you have reconciliation if you don't know the other person's culture? That's the first step, to learn it. Evan Yana Maru, Aboriginal tour guide. Terra nullius happened 250 years ago, but as we have heard today, the effects are still being felt by Indigenous people across Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are strong, enduring and adaptive, but there is still a lot of work to be done politically, educationally and socially to combat disadvantage and racism in our society. As educators, it is vital that we lead by example by ensuring we are knowledgeable about Indigenous history and culture, so that we can contest stereotypes, and that we embed Indigenous perspectives throughout our teaching so that it becomes an important part of all our lives as we share this great southern land.